When I was talking to Archmaester Hannegriff last night, and we're talking about the SEC meetings and what's going on and how this whole thing will be reshaped, and that is what is fascinating, right? We are watching a literal reimagining of the Southeastern Football Conference. And the last time one of these reimaginings went down was back in 1992, which to many of us does not sound that long ago. I was born in 89. It's 30 years ago now at this point. So for 3 decades, my entire life, essentially, we have known one way of SEC football, and that is 2 divisions where you play everybody in your division. You have one permanent opponent from across the aisle. And, even when you added teams, we kept it the same. And so it's gotten a bit long in the tooth, right? Everybody has accepted that. It has flaws in that teams just don't meet up with one another. And there are easy ways to fix those flaws, but what it takes is, again, a recasting, a reimagining of the SEC. And listening to Hanny talk about those 1992 meetings, it really drove home just how different the perception of LSU football was 30 years ago compared to where it is now, on the tail end of what you would call the golden era of LSU football. Joe Dean was the AD back in 1992 when things were split up and you were chosen, these permanent opponents were chosen, and Joe Dean didn't have any power. You think LSU wanted to get Steve Spurrier's Florida every year? Curly Hallman's LSU against Steve Spurrier's Florida? No, not at all. But they were given that because they didn't have enough power to say no. They didn't have enough cachet to kind of be like, no, this is not what's going to happen. And what's funny is at the time, Florida wasn't sweating LSU. It was like being chosen to play Mississippi State every year or South Carolina yearly. Like, the bottom line is that back 30 years ago, LSU had no real agency in what their lot would look like in this new age of SEC football. And why that is so fascinating, it is the polar opposite now, 30 years later. And granted, it took about the year 2000 until this thing really started to take off, and you had Nick Saban come and kind of awaken the slumbering beast. But as Hannegriff said on last night's Go to T podcast, by the way, you should listen to the Hannycast as well. This time LSU has a seat at the table, and a real seat at the table. Because if you look at what has happened to the Tigers after those 92 meetings, they have risen to be an undisputed national power, right? LSU is the only school that has proven in this modern era of college football to be able to win multiple national championships with multiple different coaches. And so when you combine that powerful new resume with an AD and politician of Scott Woodward's caliber, then you have to imagine that LSU will be much more in control of their place in this reimagining, in this remaking of the SEC. And it's not just Woodward, it's Brian Kelly as well. You're talking about bringing a very talented AD, but you're also talking about bringing in the winningest current college football coach in the entire country. Those are 2 men that are not going to get jerked around, that are not going to get manipulated. And so, as Kirby Smart said, right, what they're trying to do is basically impossible. Kirby Smart said, quote, trying to keep 14 to 16 teams happy, there's no model for that. That's true. Like all things in life, there will be the haves and the have-nots. Back in 1992, that led to LSU being in the have-nots. That led to you getting Steve Spurrier's elite Florida every single year, a permanent opponent that is highly challenging. Now, for Florida, it ended up being a bad draw as well, even though it didn't feel like that at the time. So they were in the have-nots. So again, 30 years later, I expect them to firmly be in the haves. I think they will go to this 9-game schedule, right? This 9-game schedule with 3 permanents and 6 rotating. We've talked about it at length at this point. It's easy to understand. It has you play a home and home with every single team in the conference if you stay for 4 years. So everybody visits everybody plays everybody. Now, there's been a bit of a pushback. And to put this have and have-nots theory to the test, it's interesting because it seems like a lot of the big dogs in Florida, Georgia, Alabama have all said, look, they are in favor of the 9-game schedule where it's schools like Kentucky and I think South Carolina was in this crew. They're kind of pushing back and say maybe we should stay to 8. Maybe we should try to keep the divisional setup. We'll see. I don't think it'll be enough for those smaller schools to dictate this. I think you're going to go to 9 games. And then the question is, who will your permanent 3 opponents be? All right? Can you avoid what happened to you all those moons ago where you got paired with an incredibly tough one in Florida? How easy can you make your draw? And on that, we will have to wait and see. As far as the 3 teams that go, I feel confident in almost all but guaranteeing that Texas A&M is one of the teams that LSU will be paired up with. Now, I think it's a bit ironic because they're kind of LSU's least traditional rival, but this is a rivalry that TV and executives have tried very hard to manufacture, and quite honestly, it's paid dividends, right? The manufacturing process worked. People hate A&M now. I hate A&M. One of the most satisfying moments of the last couple of years in the under 500 last 2 years of LSU football was Max Johnson throwing that game-winning touchdown last fall against A&M to send Jimbo and then packing to send them back to 8-4, whatever it was. And now, to add spice, you have Max Johnson as the quarterback at Texas A&M. You got the 7 overtime game. It works geographically, right? LSU's largest alumni fan base is in Houston, A&M. It makes all the sense in the world. Texas A&M, I think, is going to be a permanent opponent. So then you got 2 spots left. You got a lot of different candidates, right? You have Ole Miss, probably LSU's most traditional rival. You have Alabama, which becomes fascinating, right? Because from a competitive standpoint, why in the world would you want Alabama permanently? But from a TV standpoint, which, make no mistake, has a big role in all of this. It's why I think the 9 games will win out over the 8 is because that's just added TV revenue. That works for everybody eventually down the road. Why would they want to get rid of the game that has been the consistently highest watched game over the past decade plus? I mean, the Alabama LSU game for a time there, never forget, it had an entire ESPN the magazine committed to just one game day. So its profile is rather large. Do you really get rid of that from the TV executives? And will LSU capitulate if they're basically told, hey, look, you got to keep Alabama? And then all of a sudden, if you have A&M and Alabama in there, you're like, well, did you actually come out ahead in this thing? We'll see. So Ole Miss, maybe Alabama, maybe. I mean, you got Mississippi State, which I was interested to learn this. LSU has played Mississippi State more in football than any other team. So your actual most history is against the Bulldogs. Obviously, in terms of draws, that would be a more friendly one. And then what do you do with something like Arkansas and the Golden Boot? I don't know. We will see, right? I think it's A&M for sure, and then 2 of those other 4. I do feel confident in saying that yearly Florida is gone. As we said, when Florida was first assigned to catch these hands, they did not really care. But make no mistake, maybe nobody has suffered greater at the rise of LSU than have the Florida Gators. I mean, you basically ruined their playoff chances a couple of years ago. You are 9-3 against them in the last 12, which, by the way, I was looking up the Winsipedia, which is a great site for any kind of school-to-school rivalry that you want to check out. LSU 9-3 in their last 12. Brian Kelly must win this year. If he does, the all-time series will be tied at 33 games apiece, which would have sounded insane to someone coming out of the 90s when Florida was dominating that series yearly. Even in the early 2000s, they continued some of that domination. So Brian Kelly, get it done. Tie this thing up. Now, as far as that Alabama smoke, we will see. Boys, I want to ask you, do you want the Alabama smoke? Because Scott Woodward has said he's open to it. He's basically said that he thinks that the permanent opponent thing is a bit overblown because now you really will play everybody at such a rate that it's kind of like, whatever, you're going to be catching everybody else on a every other year basis. So what is permanent opponents really? Do you want the Alabama smoke if the Greg Sankey and the TV execs were to say, hey, we need you to play Alabama every year?
Of course. It's a legitimate rivalry. It's fun. And Saban's not going to be there forever, man. He's 70 years old. I think a lot of people, when talking about this, kind of don't factor that.
That's fair. I mean, you are right. It's definitely a prisoner moment of the situation, right? And I mean, make no mistake, what's kind of maybe working against this idea of, well, LSU, what we just laid out, LSU in and of itself shows how you have to take a long-term view on this because you don't know how teams are going to rise and fall through the ages. Like back in the early 90s, Tennessee was elite. Who would have ever wanted to catch Tennessee every single year? Now you would want to see Tennessee every year. You would almost pencil that in as a win, or at least you would have over the past 10 years. Danny, what about you? Would you want to play Alabama every year?
Yeah, I'd want to play him. Like Mario said, Nick Saban's not going to be there forever, so you can have your opportunity to dominate over them like they dominate over you, and then, yeah.
Okay, so that's an interesting perspective. So y'all think that, in the post-Saban era, then that maybe if you're playing them every year, maybe the opportunity for you is to go through your own little dominant decade-long stretch. Y'all are braver than me. Maybe I'm a coward. I would have no problem losing the Alabama game. Like
You're
I said,
coward.
you would still see them. I don't know if I need because I don't know when Nick Saban's going to retire. Like, I'm 33 now, whatever. We're all getting older. Every day is a step closer to the grave. Like, if it's 10 more years, I don't think I want to play every year for 10 more years. Like, sure, maybe it gets better after that, but I'll be 43. My kids will be old. They'll be going into high school, all this stuff. Like, I don't know if I want to suffer at the hands of Saban for another 10 years. You're shaking your head, Mari. You think I'm a coward?
Yeah, that's not that old. You have your whole 40s and your whole 50s in a post-Nick Saban world. If Hester was here, he would flex the fact that they never lost at Alabama.
I know, which is just such a... And I've told him this to his face. I'm not talking... Like, I will call him out on this. It's such a pointless perspective because it's just looking at one tiny little window of the LSU history and using that to dictate how we feel nowadays. Not only the fact that, we are old, and that tiny little window was a long-ass time ago. Sure, we beat Alabama every year, 03 to 07 or whatever. But guess what? You beat them once in the last 10 years now, and you mainly got embarrassed during that time.
But that'll potentially be the reality again when he goes. It'll be like when they had Shula and whoever else was in between Bear Bryant and Saban. I mean, for me growing up, LSU kind of had the upper hand in that series, but then Saban showed up and it changed everything. That being said, I don't think they're going to catch them like they caught Florida. I'm looking at the series right now, and it's 55-26. But no. LSU could put a dent in that once Nick goes.
Yeah, maybe so. I do agree with Brian Burns. He said that I'd rather play the Gumps every year than UF. Like, if I was given an Alabama-Florida choice, although Florida is probably the easier one, ironically, I would choose Alabama because it's just, I think it's a more valuable matchup, and a more traditional one in many ways. But I don't know. I don't want either. I don't want Alabama. I don't want Florida. Give me like an A&M. Give me a Mississippi State. And then, who would I want to be the third?
Arkansas?
Yeah, because I don't think you're going to get both Mississippi schools. I would be cool with Ole Miss and Mississippi State, but A&M, Mississippi State, Arkansas. Now, that would be a very friendly draw, I would think. I don't imagine that was going to happen, but you all know how I feel about the Golden Boot.
Every other school in the West has like an in-state opponent, right? LSU would be the only one that wouldn't have one. The Mississippi, Texas. So I would think LSU would be matched up with Arkansas if it was the one permanent opponent.
That is kind of the closest about that makes sense. All right, we'll see. What do you think? Do you want that Alabama smoke? Maybe you do a little Citizens Bank Trust poll question of the day. If you could choose, would you take Alabama on yearly or not? If they told you to. When we get back, let's talk a little Hattiesburg Regional, and then we got the Greg Sankey interview as Jake Hester sat down with the SEC commish. Keep it locked right here on OTB.